Okay, so today we're going to start the nervous system, and we're actually going to spend the rest of the semester on the nervous system because it is so complex, but also just fascinating once you really dive into it. So we're, like always, going to start at the micro level of organization and then work our way on up to the macro level. And so speaking of looking at things at the micro level of organization, we have the ability today to use things like confocal microscopy and, again, tagging things with these radioactive dyes to be able to image things at the cellular level in a way that we never were capable of before. And this really allows us to kind of understand what's going on at the cellular level of organization here. So there's a lab called NeuroCytoLab, and they're actually studying the cytoskeletal elements, just specifically the cytoskeletal elements of neurons. And again, neurons being your major cell that, again, is going to pass on information, to transmit information throughout the body. So when we talk about this actin here, actin's going to kind of play a different role in that it kind of has, because we just talked a lot about actin in muscle cells. But here, actin is going to have this, again, cytoskeletal role, this kind of structural role. And this lab, NeuroCytoLab, is actually studying the role of actin for the purposes of looking at its role in some of these like neurodegenerative diseases, where literally the axon, this part, kind of breaks down. And so it's really interesting. I don't have time to get into some of the cool research that they're doing, but I did tag this. If you are interested in this, you can click on this and it takes you to this lab and you can look at some of the research they're doing, which is pretty impressive. Oh, and there you go. I'm taking you to it there. So yeah, if you've got the time, please look into that. Or if you're interested, please look into that. Okay, so let's get into just talking about the nervous system in general, and then we're going to kind of break things down. So I am going to kind of start at the, I am going to kind of go backwards and start at the macro level and work my way down. But then we're going to kind of work our way back up, just to give you kind of this big overview of how big the nervous system is initially. Okay, so the nervous system, again, along with the endocrine system, remember the endocrine system is your hormone system, right? Where you're releasing hormones into the bloodstream, and those hormones, again, can start to coordinate certain things to maintain homeostasis. So your nervous system and your endocrine system are the two major systems that are going to coordinate all the other systems to maintain homeostasis, to maintain that state of sameness. And really, the nervous system is kind of the master controller, right? And it's going to communicate with all of these other systems of the body. And it will even communicate again with the endocrine system. The cells will communicate via these electrical and chemical signals that we're going to get into. We'll talk really detailed about the nitty-gritty details of how these electrical signals and chemical signals are passed on down an individual neuron, and then how they're passed on from neuron to neuron or neuron to muscle, kind of like we already kind of talked about neuron to muscle and neuron to organ, so on. So we are going to get into the nitty-gritties of that and how these cells actually communicate with each other. But we do know, again, as you guys probably know, it's very rapid and very specific. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then usually, again, is almost always causing some type of instantaneous response. So again, here you want to grip your pen, and you have no idea every day when you pick up your pen or you go to type on your computer, how much has to go on for you to be able to do that, for you to be able to contract all the muscles in the right way to be able to type and write. I mean, again, once we get into this, I think that you're going to find that it's just fascinating that more doesn't go wrong with how complex it is. It's fascinating to me. I still, to this day, I've taught anatomy for how many years, and I'm still amazed by this fact. Okay, so when we talk about the nervous system, again, it is going to control and integrate all of these body activities that we have to maintain life. And mainly, again, to maintain life at homeostasis, right? We're trying to keep our body at the certain state of sameness, or that state that our body's happy at, okay? And so we have different parts of our nervous system that are going to have these kind of different functions. And of course, these functions do overlap, but these are some of our major functions. We're going to break down our nervous system a little bit more in just a minute. But we mainly, when we're talking about our nervous system, we have kind of sensory input, where again, we're bringing their sensory receptors out in our skin and that are detecting things like, again, pressure and heat and things like that. And they're detecting these changes that are happening outside your body and also inside our body as well. We have sensory receptors detecting changes inside our body, like the stretch in our bladder, right? As it, again, gets larger and is holding, again, more urine. So all important sensory information that we need to take back to our brain. So that sensory information is gathered and then sent back to the brain, okay, through these sensory neurons that we'll talk about. And then once we get to, again, the brain, sometimes the spinal cord, that's going to be where integration happens. This is where, again, we're going to process and kind of interpret all of this sensory input and basically make our decision of what to do about it, okay? So again, if we're getting sensory input that, hey, your hand is near something hot, we obviously, during that integration process, want to remove our hand from that source. Or, again, we need to make a decision about what to do as our bladder is expanding, right? In terms of, potentially, again, initiating some pain sensation so that prompts us to do, micturition, so things like that. Sorry, and micturition is just that process of urinating, but you'll get into that in 202. You don't need to know that now. And then we have our motor output, which is, again, going to be now the response, right, to that sensory input. So now we're actually going to have this kind of motor output. So we have these motor neurons that are going to go to things like muscles and glands and our organs. And it's going to tell these effector organs, like our muscles in our hand, to pull away from the heat, okay? So those are all of the basic parts, again, to the nervous system. So again, we're taking in sensory input, whether we see it or smell it or touch it. We're getting the sensory input in, or whether it's, again, just like a mechanical receptor in our organs saying, whoa, hey, things are stretching or whatnot, okay? So we have all these different types of sensory input. So sometimes we just think of sensory input like in terms of our basic senses, like when we think of our 5 senses and things like that. But there's a lot more that goes on also inside the body to, again, do some sensory input from inside the body. So again, we've got sensory receptors on organs and things like that as well that can detect changes that are occurring in those organs. And then that sensory input, again, is going to come back to the brain and sometimes the spinal cord, where, again, that information will be integrated and then a decision will be made to do a certain motor output, okay? So again, those are kind of the basics to the nervous system. Now, the nervous system is divided mainly into 2 principal parts, and you probably already know this. That's the central nervous system, which is, of course, mostly the brain and the spinal cord, okay? It is the brain and the spinal cord. So, and that is going to be, remember, in your dorsal body cavity, just kind of as a reminder from the very beginning of the semester. We find our brain and our spinal cord in our dorsal body cavity in the posterior portion there. And again, of course, this is going to be where integration is going to happen. This is our control center, right? Our brain is our major control center. And this is where we're going to interpret sensory information, and then we're going to decide what motor output has to happen, okay? So again, just like we are interpreting, again, that our hand is near a hot stove, and we want to dictate our motor output being that we pull our hand away, okay? And then we have our peripheral nervous system. And our peripheral nervous system is, of course, outside the central nervous system. So it's on the periphery, right, of the brain and the spinal cord. And so this is going to be the stuff going to and leaving the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, these are going to be our nerves that are going to and from the brain and the spinal cord. So of course we have our spinal nerves that are going to and from the spinal cord. And then we also have our cranial nerves, which are going to and from the brain. Okay, so pretty easy so far, right? And then we do have these things called ganglia. We're not going to talk a lot about them yet, but we will get into them, and I'll talk a little bit about them in this lecture when we talk about the different structural types of neurons. But that we'll really get into them in the next couple lectures down from this. So ganglia are going to be these little pockets that are located outside the brain and the spinal cord. And they're kind of this small masses of mostly, we're going to talk about this in just a minute, mostly cell bodies of neurons. So, and again, we're going to talk about what these cell bodies of the neurons are in just a minute. So we'll talk about why this is too in just a minute when I get to the different structural types of neurons. So kind of just keep that in the back of your mind, ganglia. So here you can see again, central nervous system. Sorry, my arrows are in white here, and I tried to change this, but when I copied the image, for some reason, it came across this way from the text. So, but all this is doing is showing you again that the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, just the spinal cord, not the spinal nerves, but just the spinal cord. So brain, spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system is going to be all these cranial nerves that are coming to and from the brain, and then also these spinal nerves. So all these spinal nerves that are coming to and from the spinal cord, as well as these things called ganglia, okay? And you'll see that these ganglia are going to be important because, again, most of our sensory neurons have these kind of goofy, not goofy, but these special designs and structural designs that have these cell bodies that are kind of hanging out in these ganglia. So we'll get there. So just kind of keep that in mind. So again, some of the major structures of the nervous system. So again, obviously we talked about the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. We talked about the peripheral nervous system being cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and the ganglia. We've got lots of these peripheral nerves out again that are really going to be again out in our extremities. But we didn't talk about some of these kind of sensory receptors that we have in our skin, things like that. So you guys remember these, the Meissner's corpuscles and the Pacinian corpuscles, things like that, that are going to be detecting, again, pressure and touch and things like that in the skin. And then we also have what's oftentimes referred to as kind of the second brain. And that's because we have this whole enteric nervous system. They actually call it the enteric nervous system. And that's going to be kind of our gut nervous system now. And what we found is that there are a lot of neurons in the lining the digestive tract. A lot of neurons and a lot of sensory neurons, a lot of sensory receptors, a lot of sensory neurons. And so we've given it its kind of own little group called the enteric plexus and or the enteric nervous system. And they're doing a lot of research on this. It's kind of, again, called your gut brain. And so this has kind of been a big focus for a lot of the recent research. And obviously it's not a real brain because it's in your peripheral nervous system. But it's just fascinating because there are so many neurons going to the gut and so much information is coming in from the gut. This is also why, again, if you've ever had some type of gastrointestinal disorder, that it can be extremely painful, and that is because of all of this nervous intervention. So just a little bit of interesting information. I know that we're not getting into the peripheral nervous system just yet, but I like to introduce this so that way then when we do get to the peripheral nervous system, it'll be a little bit less confusing. So when we look at the peripheral nervous system actually has kind of two major divisions. It has what's called the sensory or afferent division, and then it has the motor or efferent division, okay? Now, It's always, I think, hard for students to remember afferent and efferent, right? In terms of what afferent and efferent does. Because you're going to hear these terms used in 202 for other structures as well. So it's good to get this in your mind now. Think of efferent as exiting, okay? So think efferent, exit. So these are going to be the motor neurons. Your efferent division is going to be your motor neurons. They're going to be neurons that are going to be exiting, taking information and exiting the central nervous system. Okay? Now, afferent is going to be taking things to something. So afferent's just the opposite. That's why I think it's easiest to remember efferent first, and then the afferent is the opposite of it. So afferent division is going to be taking things to the central nervous system in this case. And so here, these are going to be your sensory neurons. So things, and when we break up our sensory neurons, again, our sensory neurons are detecting stuff, again, in the either changes in the outside world or changes inside our body and bringing it back to the brain, okay? And we can break that into the somatic sensory fibers, and this is where it really helps to know that soma means body. So soma means body. Think soma means body. Soma means body. So this is stuff that's conveying impulses from like your skin and your skeletal muscles and your joints all the way back to the central nervous system, okay? And kind of the rest of your body outside of your organs. And then your visceral sensory fibers, again, remember viscera. Remember, I don't like to eat visceral mass because it's organs, right? So visceral sensory fibers are conveying impulses from the visceral organs, okay? Again, visceral organs to the central nervous system, okay? So those are the two types of sensory divisions, somatic and visceral, okay? And then our efferent division, again, is going to be taking information after integration has happened in the central nervous system, because remember, that happens in the central nervous system. That's why we're not including that integration here. Then we have the motor division, okay? The second major, again, division of the peripheral nervous system. And again, this is going to be taking impulses from the central nervous system to effector organs, to muscles, to glands, okay? To organs. So again, it's efferent because it's exiting that central nervous system. And so we, of course, have two branches of this motor division. I know you guys are like, you're killing me. And that's why I'm introducing this twice, because I want to give this to you early on so that you can start to kind of memorize this chart, or hopefully you don't have to memorize it. Hopefully you can make sense of this. But so there are two divisions of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, and that's your somatic nervous system and your autonomic nervous system. So your somatic nervous system is going to be the nervous system that you have control over. You've got voluntary control over this, okay? So when you're climbing a mountain or you're snowboarding and you're asking your skeletal muscles to do the things that they need to do to climb that mountain, or again to, snowboard down the side of that hill, you're using your somatic nervous system, okay? So that's your somatic motor system. So your somatic motor nerve fibers, again, are conducting impulses from the central nervous system to skeletal muscles. And this is under conscious voluntary control. You are, again, consciously controlling things. The autonomic nervous system is a perfect example of it. Not a runner, now you are, okay? This is going to be stuff like your fight or flight response, okay? So your autonomic, I always like to say, autonomic nervous system is under automatic control. That's the easy way to remember it. Autonomic, automatic. It's, again, under involuntary control, you don't have to think about it, okay? It's happening subconsciously. You are not consciously activating yourself to run from the scary bear. You're not consciously, some of it you are, but you're not consciously like activating your heart to beat faster and pump faster so that you can bring oxygen quicker to those muscles. So again, obviously some of this you're under control, but some of that response is just happening as soon as you see that scary bear and you like all of a sudden feel this rush go through your body as you all of a sudden fear hits you as a bear is chasing you, right? So this is your autonomic nervous system. And again, this is going to consist of these kind of visceral motor nerve fibers that are going to things like smooth muscle, that are going to things like cardiac muscle to say, hey, come on, heart, you got to pump faster. I need more oxygen because I need to run from this scary bear. And again, to glands. So again, this is under involuntary control. And again, you do have two different divisions of this. Now, I have primarily, obviously, just described the sympathetic nervous system, but you do have the parasympathetic nervous system, and it's just the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, it's what we call your kind of rest and digest. So if you want to write on the side here, sympathetic, if you haven't already heard this, the sympathetic nervous system, and I'm not going to take the time to write it because my writing's horrible here. But I would put on the side here, sympathetic, fight or flight, okay? So this is your, again, kind of panic system. This is your panic button. And then your parasympathetic is just the opposite. It's your rest and digest. It's the system that takes over when you're sleeping or you're digesting, okay? And again, they work in opposition to each other. So here is a great example of your sympathetic, your panic system. And then here, parasympathetic, you're digesting, right? Or resting. In this case, a little bit of both. So that's your major organization of the nervous system. So this is a nice chart to kind of put it all together. So here, again, is your central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord, right? And it's receiving information from and sending information out via motor neurons, sensory neurons coming in, motor neurons going out, okay, to the peripheral nervous system. And that peripheral nervous system, again, is going to include things like cranial nerves and your spinal nerves that are basically your main lines of communication between the central nervous system and the rest of the body, okay? That's the main job of the peripheral nervous system, right? So the peripheral nervous system, of course, is taking sensory information in via these afferent neurons, afferent sensory neurons, okay? And they're, again, conducting these impulses from these sensory receptors, okay, out at the end of the body here and bringing, or again, from organs inside the body and bringing that sensory information in, again, to the central nervous system. Our next division for the peripheral nervous system, so again, these are our two divisions of the peripheral nervous system, sensory afferent division. Our next division is the motor efferent division, okay? And again, this is conducting impulses from the central nervous system after integration has happened. You've decided what, again, response you want to take. And so now you have these motor efferent neurons, again, efferent, exiting the central nervous system and conducting those impulses to your effectors, things like muscles and glands and smooth muscle and your organs, okay? And so again, here, that motor efferent division, of course, is going to be divided again, okay? And so we divide it up into the somatic nervous system, which you have control over, okay? And so this is where we're going to conduct impulses from the central nervous system to skeletal muscles, okay? So again, you want to skateboard, okay? And you want to tell your muscles to do the activity, or mountain bike, or, again, any type of activity that you want to do with your muscles. You want to tell your muscles to type on the computer, okay? That's under that somatic motor system, okay? Now, the autonomic nervous system, again, is the system that's subconscious. You are not actively thinking about this. It's not under voluntary control. It's under, again, what we call involuntary control because you're not actively thinking about it. And again, this is the branch that is going to carry impulses to things like your cardiac muscle, smooth muscle in your organs and your glands, okay? And so the autonomic nervous system, of course, is then divided again into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, okay? And again, your sympathetic nervous system is all about like mobilizing your body systems during like an intense activity, right? It's that fight or flight. And then your parasympathetic is all about kind of conserving energy and doing some of your housekeeping functions, especially while you're sleeping and resting. Again, helping you to digest and do those types of things. So, here you go. This is, I feel like everybody looks at this slide and then they're like this. I hate the human nervous system. So, but hopefully by the end of these lectures, and you'll get this again, hopefully a couple times, this one might be one of the pictures you want to put up again on your mirror so that you can kind of like look at that every day when you're brushing your teeth. And by the end of this, hopefully, instead of hating the human nervous system, you'll have this appreciation for its complexity. And again, the fact that more stuff doesn't go wrong. That's the crazy part, okay? So let's get into the nitty-gritties of some of the structures of the nervous system. And let's talk about, now we're going to really break things down to the cellular level of organization, okay? So a nerve is actually a bundle of hundreds and even thousands of what are called axons of our neurons, okay? And each of these, again, is going to have this kind of defined path and it's going to serve a very specific region of the body. And again, we'll kind of talk about that as we work our way back up. And of course, again, we already talked about that we have these sensory afferent neurons, right, that are going to be sensing changes in our external environment as well as, again, sensing changes in our internal environment. Again, like that full bladder, right, as it stretches. And then they're also going to be analyzing, again, this information in the central nervous system, right? So once that sensory information is brought in, it's brought into the central nervous system, and then we have our interneurons, right, that are going to serve this function of, again, analyzing that information and then deciding what decision is going to be made. And then again, as a reminder, then when we respond to the stimuli, that's going to be through our motor efferent neurons, okay? So keep that in mind because we're going to talk about these. So make sure that you're really familiar with these terms, sensory or afferent neurons, the association or interneurons, okay? And then motor or efferent neurons. You should be able to know both these terms interchangeably, okay? Sensory and afferent neurons will be used interchangeably all throughout, not just here, but also in 202. So make sure that you know both terms, okay? So again, sensory neurons are also called afferent neurons, association neurons are also called interneurons, and motor neurons are also called efferent neurons, okay? So let's get into the histology. I know you guys are already screaming, no, not the histology, but just hang in there with me. It's not too bad. Really, it's not. So like always, you know we always do this. We always kind of break things up and categorize our cells by structure as well as function. And so that's what we're going to do here. But first, before we do that, before we kind of break up our cells, let's talk about the fact that we have different types of cells. So when we look at our nervous system, you're going to see that we have our actual neurons. The neurons are the ones that are like transmitting the messages. They're the ones that are doing work. They're the ones that you think of. When you think of the nervous system, you're like, okay, these are the guys that have the dendrites and the axon. Those, again, are your main cells that are doing the work of the nervous system. But, again, their main function is to transmit those messages, right? To take in new messages, transmit messages, make decisions about where the message is going to go next. So, because they're so busy, they can't support themselves. And so, you know, they're kind of like these really important cells, but they don't have the time to feed themselves. It sounds kind of like us, many of us, right? We don't have time to feed ourselves. We don't have time to get rid of our waste, to go to the bathroom. Who has time to do that? So they have all these specialized cells to do that for them. So these are the neuroglial cells. The neuroglial cells are like these cells that are like, look, neuron, you are too important. We need you to do your stuff. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to like clean up your waste. We're going to feed you. We're going to make sure that, nothing is coming in to attack you. We'll try to take care of that. So that's the neuroglial cells. And again, they play a very important role because without those neuroglial cells, the neurons couldn't exist, right? They couldn't survive. So again, those are the two major types of cells. So first, in this lecture, we're going to talk about neurons, and in the next lecture, we'll talk about neuroglial cells. Okay, so, and then what we're going to do now is, again, focus on just neurons. So as we talk about neurons, we're going to break our neurons up into the dendrites and the cell body of a neuron, the axon of a neuron, and then the axon terminal and the synaptic end bulbs. Now, you guys already know a little bit about the synaptic end bulbs because we had to talk about them with the neuromuscular junctions. So you at least already know a little bit about this, okay? So when we look at a slide of this, you can't really tell the difference between your axons and your dendrites in a lot of these slides because you're just seeing a little portion of a neuron. And a lot of times, again, in the cell prep, you just don't get a really good image of it. Now, in some of the confocal microscope images, you can tell the difference between the dendrites and axons. But again, in most of these images, you can't. Or in most of the just the compound microscope, images that you're going to see, you can't tell the difference. Okay, and then we talked about those neuroglial cells as the helper cells. Okay, so back again but again, we're focusing on just our neuron. So let's talk about these parts to the neuron. Again, remember, we're going to break it up into the dendrites and the cell body. Okay, so here's the cell body. Here's all these dendrites. And then we're going to break it up into the axon, and we'll talk about the axon, and then we'll talk about the axon terminal and the synaptic end bulbs here. Okay, so let's talk about these dendrites. What are all these little hairy things coming off of the cell body? And so these are the things that are going to bring in the impulses towards the soma or the cell body, okay? So again, remember, think of soma as body. So here, this is the cell body, the body of the cell, okay? And we'll talk about it in just a minute. It's really where you have all your organelles and all that stuff. It's what you think of when you think of a cell. So the dendrites are bringing in impulses and messages to that cell body, okay? So they're conveying those incoming messages towards the cell body. Now, I'm introducing this now because we're going to talk about it later, but they do this in the form of what we call graded potential. Graded potentials are because they're just bringing it in a short distance, okay? You're going to see that that's very different than the action potential that we're going to send down an axon, okay? So I just put that here, so now you can kind of start to put that in your brain that those incoming messages are coming in the form of graded potentials, okay? Again, I just like to give you these things a couple times. Typically, these dendrites are going to be kind of short and really branched, and they are not going to be myelinated, okay? So you're going to see that's very different than the axon, which is myelinated. It has a special kind of coating here called the myelin sheath, okay? But here, dendrites, none, no myelin sheath, okay? And the surfaces are really specialized to have contact with other neurons, and oftentimes with many other neurons, okay? And so, again, the dendrites are going to bring in these messages towards the cell body. Here's the cell body. And the cell body is going to contain all your usual suspects for a cell, right? It's going to contain a nucleus. It's going to contain the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria. It's going to contain ribosomes, lysosomes, all of those things that typically you're going to find in a normal cell, okay? And then it's going to have a few extra things. So it's going to have these things called neurofibrils. And these neurofibrils you can actually see here, inside here, that are going to provide shape and support. So these neurofibrils are going to be, again, these cytoskeletal elements, things like actin, that are going to make up these neurofibrils and provide the support and shape for that cell body, as well as it will for the dendrites and the axon. And then inside the cell body, you're also going to find these weird groups of free ribosomes and oftentimes little bits of clusters of rough endoplasmic reticulum in like little clusters. So instead of that, you're going to have the main rough endoplasmic reticulum, but then you're going to find that there's these little clusters of like ribosomes and rough endoplasmic reticulum here. And they're going to be called Nissl bodies, okay? So here's the Nissl bodies. And so think for a minute, why, now that you know a little bit about neuromuscular junctions, why might we have these Nissl bodies? Now, remember that, try to think about what ribosomes do, okay? And ribosomes on the rough endoplasmic reticulum do as well. Remember that these guys are making proteins. Okay? Now, when we talked about proteins, there's a lot of certain types of proteins that neurons are going to have to release. So they're going to have to make lots of them. So at your neuromuscular junction, you may remember those acetylcholine vesicles, right? Remember those acetylcholine vesicles? That's a lot of neurotransmitter. And those neurotransmitters, again, are made of proteins. So that's a lot of protein that has to be made. So your cell body has these specialized structures called the Nissl bodies that are designed, again, to make neurotransmitter, make vesicles of these neurotransmitters. So those vesicles can then get sent down the axon and into these axon terminals. Now, we need to, because we're going to have to transport those neurotransmitter vesicles, we're going to do that, if you remember, on microtubules. Remember, microtubules, again, are going to be these kind of, they're going to create our highways for transporting vesicles, and you're going to have these like motor proteins that are carrying these big vesicles on them that are going to creep down the microtubules. I know that was a long time ago from the beginning of the semester, but hopefully you kind of remember that visual. So that's exactly what's going to happen. Again, you're going to make neurotransmitter at places like these Nissl bodies, and then those neurotransmitter, the vesicles of bunches of neurotransmitter are going to creep down the microtubules and the axon down to these axon terminals where they can be released. So kind of cool. And so we primarily have only talked about things like acetylcholine, but there's a lot of other neurotransmitters that are going to be released. Things like epinephrine and norepinephrine, so dopamine. So there are lots of other neurotransmitters, but acetylcholine is one as well. So let's talk a little bit about this axon now. What about this thing here? So axon, again, that axon is going to conduct impulses away from the cell body. So dendrites are taking impulses in. Axon is conducting it away from the cell body, okay? And typically, we haven't gotten quite into this yet, but I'm, again, going to introduce it now, and I will remind you later that when we are going to begin what's called an action potential, where we're going to transmit, after we took in this message from the dendrites, we're going to really transmit that message down all the way to these axon terminals. That message, that impulse that we're going to start is going to arise in the axon hillock. The axon hillock is just this section that connects the cell body to the axon. That's all the axon hillock is. But inside the axon hillock is this trigger zone, okay? It's at this right before this first segment here. And this trigger zone, okay, is where we're going to initiate what's called an action potential. That's going to swoop past the message down all the way down that axon. Okay? We do have these, once we get to the end here, that axon can branch into these bigger branches called collaterals, okay? And then eventually they're going to end in these little tiny branches with a bulb at the end. These are called axon terminals. And then, of course, at the very end here, that's called the synaptic end bulb, okay? So again, the collaterals are these bigger branches, and then these here, the axon terminal is the little tiny branch that ends with the synaptic end bulb, okay? And you guys know what the synaptic end bulb is going to be doing, because just like, again, in the neuromuscular junction, it is going to be releasing neurotransmitter, okay? So it's going to be filled with neurotransmitters ready to release. So again, I like this little cartoon here. Dendrites, let's take the message. So again, dendrites taking in the message, and then again, axons send it out through the, again, axon terminal. Okay. So again, that's kind of the main function of the axons. The axon is going to be the conducting region of the neuron. It's going to generate that nerve impulse. And again, we're going to talk about exactly how it does this coming up in the next lecture. And then it's going to transmit that nerve impulse across what's called the axolemma. Okay. So again, the axolemma here, kind of like the sarcolemma. Remember, the sarcolemma was the cell membrane of the muscle cell. Here, the axolemma is the cell membrane of the axon part of the neuron, okay? So this is part of the neuron cell membrane on the axon, okay? So we're gonna generate this nerve impulse, okay, and transmit it all along the axolemma, that is cell membrane, all the way to the axon terminals, okay? And then at the very end of those axon terminals are those synaptic end bulbs that are gonna be triggered to release neurotransmitter into the extracellular space, okay? And just like they did when they released acetylcholine into that extracellular space that we call the synaptic cleft, okay? And then they can either excite, those neurotransmitters might excite the next neuron, okay? So that here you can see, here's those synaptic end bulbs, and they're touching again the dendrites of the next neuron, and they can again excite that neuron, or they can be releasing inhibitory neurotransmitters, okay, that are going to inhibit and keep that neuron from passing on the message, preventing it from passing on a message. Okay, so again, all kinds of fun things that we are going to get into as we really talk about what is happening here at the cellular level. Okay. And again, axons can pass on information from, again, they might be taking in many different messages through those dendrites in that neuron, and then transmitting that information. And the important part about axons to remember is that they really rely on the cell body to help renew their proteins, to help renew their membranes anytime that there is damage. And what this means is that it takes a bit of time to repair. And so, unfortunately, they quickly decay if they're cut or damaged. And that really becomes a problem in things like when I worked with multiple sclerosis, where you have damage from your own, it's an autoimmune disease where your own immune cells damage your neurons. And again, you have a short period of time for those axons to be able to repair themselves before they quickly decay. And once they decay and they're too damaged, then you can't get that neuron back. And it's oftentimes for multiple sclerosis patients, it means they lose function. So I like this slide that says, what did the axon terminal say to the dendrite when he dropped the information? Oh, synapse. Come on. I got to keep you guys awake. So instead of oh, synapse, come on. The puns here are beautiful for the nervous system. You have to appreciate them. So again, of course, this is called a synapse, where the axon terminal is going to release neurotransmitter to the dendrites of a neighboring neuron. Okay, so that's called a synapse. So again, our axons are actually able to take information in both directions. And so, of course, we give these different directions, names. So we have what's called anterograde, which is where, again, an axon is going to take information away from a cell body. That's kind of typically what you're thinking of, right? As, again, our dendrites, again, are taking in, a message and passing it on to the axon terminal. And then, again, as that electrical message is being sent down transmitted down the axon and then out. That's enterograde. Okay. And so again, examples of this are, again, we're going to be bringing things like mitochondria, cytoskeletal elements, membrane components, maybe to fix, again, the axon, enzymes, things like that need to be brought into the axon, as well as, of course, neurotransmitter, right? Because neurotransmitter vesicles are going to need to be released at that synaptic end bulb. Now, retrograde is going to be the opposite. Retrograde is when we're going to transport things from, again, the axon terminals up to the cell body. So that's retrograde. It's kind of the opposite direction, retro of what we think it should go, right? And so this will happen, again, of course, when things like organelles were degraded and we need to kind of bring them back to be broken down here. Sometimes signal molecules that need to be broken down. But also the reason that this is important to understand is this retrograde movement on the axon terminal can also transmit things like viruses and bacterial toxins. And so this becomes a problem, again, for certain viruses like the herpes simplex virus, things like, again, rabies. They can be brought in, the tetanus toxin can be brought in through those axon terminals and then passed down the axon to the cell body where they're really going to cause issues. So that's why it's kind of important to understand this retrograde, what we call retrograde axonal transport. Again, going kind of the opposite direction down the axon. Now, the interesting part is there's some really interesting research going underway right now looking at retrograde gene therapy to treat certain genetic disorders, and especially certain genetic disorders that cause neurodegenerative diseases. So things like Parkinson's. And so what they're doing is they're looking at sending in viruses that contain like corrected genes or like a little microRNA that could be, again, sent and injected into the nucleus of the cell body. Again, with obviously, again, you're going to inject in this area where it could be taken up by the synaptic end bulb and then brought down via retrograde transport down that axon and into, again, the cell body. And then what the hope is that, again, they can inject these corrected genes or some type of gene that will suppress the defective genes. And they can do this through that retrograde transport and hopefully, treat some of these neurological disorders and stop that neurodegenerative process. So again, if you're interested in this, I'd love to talk about this because I could talk about this all day, but super interesting. Check out this article if you'd like. Really interesting on retrograde gene therapy if you want to dig into that. Okay, so now, as always, you can break things up into both the structural and functional features of neurons. And so here's my, the structure really define function. So again, like always, we like to classify things by their structural classification, by their actual structure, and then by what they do, their function. And so that's what we're going to do with neurons. And keep in mind that most of the neurons in the body are going to be these interneurons. And so we'll talk about how we're going to classify these in terms of structure and function. So I'm going to actually get into this into the next lecture, and I will start the next lecture with the classification of these different types of neurons, and then we'll talk about those neuroglial cells.